welcome to Non-Boring History. My name is Annette Lang, and today we're going to be talking about a truly fantastic book, Sweet Freedom's Plains, African Americans on the Overland Trail from 1841 to 1869, written by Shirley Ann Wilson Moore. And this is a terrific book. It's an academic book, but please don't stop watching, okay? Because I do think this is a book that will engage an awful lot of people outside of history departments. And I'm delighted to say that today I have with me via Zoom, Dr. Moore herself. She holds a PhD in American history from the University of California, Berkeley. She is a professor emerita at California State University, Sacramento. She's a specialist in African American history and especially African American women in the West. She's the author of 3 books, including this one, as well as numerous articles, essays, and book chapters. And she has served as a consultant on projects with the public, including with the National Park Service, as well as on various documentaries. So with that, thank you very much for joining me at Non-Boring History today, Shirley. I appreciate it.
Well, it's my pleasure, and it's a delightful name too, so we'll have to live up to Non-Boring History, right?
All right, exactly. Well, we will do to historians. This is not a good start. We will do our best. Right? So, who were they? Who were the African American folks who went west?
Well, that's a really good question. Now, as to numbers, I don't think we'll ever establish a numerical number for the numbers of Black people who went west. I've seen estimates from 5,000 to 50,000. So we'll never know because, and this is interesting, because the people, officials who are in charge with census taking of the travelers who are going along the roads, and those who were enslaved, their owners didn't refer to them or count them for anything other than Black or Black woman, Black man. So we'll never know. They were ignored and discounted, literally discounted. So we'll never know the numbers. However, one thing we have to understand, and probably most people don't think about this. First of all, they don't think that there were, in the pioneer days, the wagon train days, that African Americans were involved at all. So that is not the case. Black immigrants, travelers, were involved in every aspect of that process from start to finish, and they were not all enslaved. Many free Blacks came. So, those are sort of 2 myths that are exploded, that their invisibility doesn't stem from the fact that they weren't there. They were seen as inconsequential. And so that's where this cloak of invisibility surrounded them as far as whites were concerned.
Right, because the knowledge that most people have, I think, of the wagon trains is based more on 1950s Westerns than anything else. Right. I mean, most people haven't a clue. Yeah. Starting with people not traveling in the wagons, but walking next to them.
That's
but
right.
Certainly, what makes Black folks' overland journey especially significant?
That's an excellent question. That's one of the questions I set out to explore in Sweet Freedom's Plains. And what I discovered is that for many Blacks, they came west for some of the same, similar reasons as their white counterparts did. The West was a land of starting over in the popular imagination. It was a place where you could reinvent yourself, a place where you had greater freedoms. That was, in the popular imagination, and certainly African Americans held to those reasons. But they also, especially those who were enslaved And then those who were restricted by Black laws and Black codes, even if you were free in the so-called free states, and certainly in the slave states, if you had a free status, that meant very little. You were hemmed in by laws. You were not allowed to exercise. You had no political status. You had no citizenship status. So it was tough for even free Blacks who in free states and certainly in the South. So they came west seeking relief from those conditions. The title of the book, as a matter of fact, came from an old abolitionist hymn that was, abolitionist words, the anti-slavery movement grafted onto hymns that people knew, the words of anti-slavery. And I'll give you just a brief bit of it. The title is from one of these hymns, abolitionist hymns, called "The Flying Slave," and one verse in that hymn says, "Behind I left the whips and chains, before me lay sweet freedom's plains." So that's where the title comes from, and it's that alone was, worth the discovery. I knew when I heard it that would be the title for the book. I knew it.
So when people embark full of hope on this journey west, this we know was not an easy journey for anybody.
No, or anybody.
Yeah, exactly. What specific challenges did Black folks run into?
Well, as I said, they were counted, whether they were free or enslaved, they were counted as non-people. Now, many wagon companies had in their charters provisions that restricted them from taking on Black travelers. Even if they could pay, they weren't allowed to be on those trains. So once they could secure passage, either by paying or working, they had to wait around those jumping off towns longer than their white counterparts. They had to, figure out where they were going to stay as they waited, that kind of. So from the beginning, even before they hit the trails, this was the dilemma that the whites didn't face, white travelers, overlanders didn't face. And on the trails, they were, of course, as slaves, they were required to, everybody worked. I mean, everybody worked under horrific conditions that we would just, shudder at. But for Blacks, they had no choice. They were on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They did the most onerous, difficult work possible. There is the one company that these were the so-called Mississippi Mormons that came. They were making a sort of a journey in 2 stages, and coming from Mississippi, there were a number of Blacks in that company, and one of the leaders of the train recorded that everybody suffered terrible cold conditions. They suffered terribly, but this person whose name escapes me now writes in his journal, the Negroes suffered the most, and several died and were buried along the trail. And it was commonplace for slaves to be worked in horrific conditions. And throughout the slave states, it was, slaves, especially in the wintertime, suffered from what was actually pneumonia. They called it, oh gosh, I forgot the name. It's in the book, so look it up. But they suffered from this, and they were just routinely expected to die. And so this was a burden. They were routinely expected to be, as I say in the book, pack animals.
Right. But at the same time, one of the things that really came out in the book to me, and I'm thinking here of people like George W. Bush, you can't forget that name,
okay, great.
who's handing out loans and things, and
well,
that people were, that there was this sort of crucible
yes.
on the Overland Trail. And maybe if you would address that.
Yeah, well, you know, one of the reasons you asked me that question, why did they come west? One of the popular notions about the West was that you know, so these racial proscriptions could be left behind, and capability and ability, prowess could trump those racial categories. And Bush, who was a free Black man when he left with his 5 sons and his wife, who was white, left Missouri, epitomized that. George W. Bush, that improbable name. But his chronicler and friend wrote in journals that George W. Bush was the most capable man he'd ever met. He not only financed several of the party company members who were cash-strapped, because he was a very successful farmer and businessman in Missouri. He, bought wagons for them, provisioned their wagons, and so on. When they were going through hard, really starving times, he taught them how to hunt the small game, and he was the provider. And so he's an outstanding example of that notion that ability trumps, could at times overcome those stigmas. That was on the trail. Now, when he made it to his destination in Oregon Territory, he was not allowed to own the land that he had homesteaded. And so Congress, the US Congress, had to make a special petition for George Bush to own the lands up in the Puget Sound area. So Bush, it's a fascinating story. This book is full of stories.
Yes.
It's full of footnotes, dense, wonderful footnotes, but you can ignore those. You don't have to read them.
Yeah, don't worry, audience.
but yeah, don't worry. Don't let that scare you off. The stories. I like to think that this book is full of stories that Hollywood hasn't even tapped into. Real life.
And that's absolutely right. I mean, there are so many.
Yeah.
And it complicates things, doesn't it? It's not. I can't just ask you. I've asked you to do this interview in such a short time, and we can't just reduce it to did they get there and everything went great or not, because that's impossible, right?
It is impossible to do that, but the complications, the complexities, the nuances of this whole journey, that's what makes it so interesting to me. And I think your viewers and listeners would be interested to know that these overlanders in this time span I'm looking at weren't the first Blacks in the West. You had Black mountain men, Black guides who this was their territory. And I talk about that, in the book. But I think that in the complexity, in the complications, that's where you get the real stories that come out. I want to can I back up a bit and talk about people who, let me say that once Blacks set out on the trails, the first steps on the trails, whether they were enslaved or free, they knew something had changed. And there were Blacks who, and I call them facilitators, who never made the overland journey, but were very, very instrumental in allowing it to happen, in facilitating it. One such person was a man by the name of Hiram Young. He was a former slave. He didn't know how to read or write, but he rose to be, I think, the 3rd wealthiest man in Missouri, and he's based in Independence, Missouri, because he came up with a wagon. Now, the iconic symbol, right, of the overland trip, of the pioneer days of westward migration, a wagon that was preferred by most overlanders. They called it in short a Hiram Young wagon, right? Let me see if I can get rid of this. Yeah, the Hiram Young wagon, and it was lighter, smaller, just easier to work with, and he had plaques put up on the wagons that bore his name and the name of the I think name
branding.
of the, yeah. But that didn't stop at that. He had a business conglomerate in this jumping off town of Independence, Missouri, where everybody came to provision themselves, to get supplies. He supplied them from his farms. He had cornered the market on yoke making. You know, oxen were the preferred mode of the force pulling the wagons. So he cornered the market on oxen, yokes, wagons, the food. He had farms. He was an interesting person, Hiram Young was, because he employed the slaves from the surrounding area, Missouri being a slave state, gave them a working wage. And his thought was they can buy their freedom just like as he did, and perhaps buy one of his wagons and head west. He also employed white workers and let some of them board at his home, which was breaking every racial taboo at the time. And
like the white Irishman that you mentioned.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
And so he was a facilitator. And, you know, I don't think people associate the iconic symbol of overland immigration with a Black man. You know, he made it, and, you know, he sold the wagons to anyone who could purchase them. And it was said, one of his contemporaries said that you could see Hiram Young wagons on the trails from Missouri out to California and beyond. That's how popular they were.
You know, he's mentioned at Independence, which is where I first learned of him.
Yes.
But this is news that is just not yet trickling down into schools.
That's right.
You know, I mean, I talk about the westward migration. I talk about Hiram Young in schools, and this is all kind of news to people. Have you seen some progress with you know, certainly with the National Park Service?
Yes. This book actually started out as a report. The National Park Service contacted me and asked me if I'd be interested in writing a report so they could update their materials on the various trails and their various facilities, update that signage and update the language. And I thought, well, it's intriguing. I didn't know. I like everybody else didn't know much about Blacks on the Overland Trail, and so I completed that report, and they were pleased with it. But I knew as I was working on the report, there was much more to be said about this, and that's what sparked me into continuing to this book. So I see as I go. So you know, the National Park Service wanted to make changes and be more inclusive, and I know there's a hunger out there. As I've gone around and talked about these issues, people are hungry for it, from grade schools to adults who haven't been in school in a very long time, to everybody. And it strikes a chord because there's such a diversity of experience. We can't talk about the Black overlanders' experience because they had some things in common, but they had such different experiences.
And you bring that out so well. This is a really compelling set of stories, and with really fascinating overarching arguments. And you know, I have deliberately limited us, which I hate, because I could really have this conversation all day. So if I
we
get
could.
enough demand, I'll have you back. Okay, you know, it really is. But I want to thank you so much, Dr. Moore, for taking the time out to talk to me today. I just want to remind everybody that this book is available in libraries, for sale in independent bookstores and the Amazon, we don't talk about. And I do recommend this. I don't recommend all academic books for a popular audience, the ones that I write about. But if you would like more of this kind of thing, please sign up, and you can sign up for free at Non-Boring History. Just Google it, Non-Boring History, and Annette Lang on Substack will come right to the top. So once again, thank you, Dr. Shirley Moore, for your time.
Thank you so much. Next time I come back, I have to tell you about the 2 women in the military, 2 Black women who were kicked out of the wagon train. Super story, and I'll tell you about it.
I want to hear that, and also want to talk about the cover and your interviews that you did with people, and you name it. So thank you again so much.